Had my mic on mute. Not sure how many people we've had jumping on, but on a random Tuesday talking about EPA, I'm not sure how exciting things can really get. So I try to make it as entertaining as possible. Sorry about being a little late. Had a interesting call or an OSHA interpretation on a field tech commuting to and from a customer location, and an injury occurred on the way home, and was it a recordable or not? So again, that's another interesting topic to always talk about. So maybe share my screen, keep us on track. Start back at the beginning here. Okay, here we are. Sorry about that. So anyway, get back on here. Get this rolling. But EPA compliance, right? Understanding key requirements when it comes to EPA. And some of the things that we do here, specifically, at JBT Morel, at least the locations that I oversee that I've came across, and obviously in my past, it can be a little bit boring, but it's important, right? So, sustaining environmental compliance, making the place obviously manufacturing in a way that we maintain, regulation, so we're not polluting the environment, whether it's the water source and the air, which is the big things that we definitely look at here when it comes to a lot of this stuff. So let's pull this up. Here we go. So we're gonna, key components: permitting, spill prevention, stormwater, toxic relief inventory, and chemical reporting is probably the biggest things that we cover in general. Starting with non-TV permits and Title V permits. Title V for large source under the Clean Air Act, larger manufacturers with higher emissions. Um, I know in my past, when I worked for Bungie, we had a lot of Title V air permits for different locations because of the amount of dust removal that we had, especially when it comes to agribusiness. And we got bag houses and filtration devices on your process lines when it comes to grain handling, crushing, conveying, storage, whether it's going in elevator bins, etc. So a lot of things relied on that. Most of those locations did have a separate environmental manager just because of the amount of permitting and regulatory requirements that were required, as well as most of those locations had a treatment facility or pre-treatment facility for wastewater or processed water, etc. Typically for JBT, we handle non-TV permits, and that's not at all locations specifically. It's just Sandusky. I know Kingston and Russellville have a bead blasting is typically what it's used for, the filtration to remove the dust. Um, Technically, being that it's inside the building, there's not much we have to really do from regulatory side besides an annual report and an annual emissions report and noting anything that may be deficient, which is good because we don't really, nothing really kind of goes out into the atmosphere. What we do have from a boiler standpoint and things in the tech centers and stuff, non-permit required because of the amount of hours that it actually runs and exactly what it does. So it's pretty straightforward when it comes to that. Um, All right, and I kind of maintained and I kind of covered some of this thing with some compliance tips and stuff, but um, when it comes to really what Title V and non-Title V kind of falls onto is kind of the Clean Air Act, right? And then of course National Ambient Air Standards, um, quality standards, and new source performance standards as well. There's no secondary containment required with air permitting. However, it does often play a role in preventing incidents and releases that can impact air quality, right? So if you do see a release, see a dusty environment, you have something else that's off gassing, the best thing you could do is report that. Oops, man, I keep hitting the wrong thing. SPCC, so spill prevention controls and countermeasures. So SPCs fall under the SPCC falls under the Clean Water Act, covers materials that we have here when it comes to used oil, waste oil, vegetable oil over a certain amount, right? We need to have a spill containment, prevention, control, countermeasures plan, over a certain amount of oil, used oil, waste oil, operating oil. You have to have a plan, the outline site diagrams, secondary containment, um, thresholds, and now obviously spill response procedures and hold, um, evacuation um, drills as well as tabletop exercises if you would have a massive spill that would occur, right? So, a lot of this oil could be quantities, storage large quantities of oil, including waste oil, used oil, vegetable oil, which we do. Right, we must develop an SPCC plan. Plan includes secondary containment measures. Um, an EPA standard here is 40 CFR 19 or 112, which outlines requirements for SPCC plans regarding training, inspections, and ensuring the effectiveness of these measures. Right, so we do that quite often. It's an annual plan review. Any kind of changes to the quantities, the amounts, changes into secondary containments would be considered. Again, this is only something that really falls under Sandusky. We've had close to getting up to higher oil quantities based off of the machines that we have that use hydraulic oil, but never been anything up over that threshold. Um, most far as secondary containments in Sandusky's really what can be held within the facility walls as well as our oil water separators. So that's a containment that, most of the drains that go to an oil water separator. The oil water separator gets backed out on a bi-monthly basis, typically. Once it gets to a certain level, right, then it would be discharged to the lake or river nearby. And don't want that to happen. We want to be contained there and then be backed out, right? So, all right. SW3P. So next thing, SW3P, moving on to SW3P, Stormwater Pollution and Prevention Plan. I know a lot of these are acronyms, right? Falls under the NEPADS permit, right? So that is National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. This plan prevents pollutants from being washed into the bodies of water during storms. Secondary containment is critical for preventing stormwater contamination, especially from oil and grease. Stored, unsheltered, unpaving parking lots, right? So that's kind of what we run into is, paved parking lots that we store equipment in that could have oil and grease on it. We're making sure that that doesn't run off, things doesn't run down a storm drain and then be discharged to a body of water. That's not what we want. Ideally, we want to keep things stored inside, but if we have to store things outside, based off our permit, we have to have monthly stormwater visual checks. Fortunately, we don't have any really points of I guess outfall points that we have to really sample. We have outfall points, right? But we don't have anything that we have to sample like oil and grease, dissolvable solids, anything, any other pollutants that you might have and have to sample for your wastewater permit. It really depends on, what you're permitted for based off what you're storing, what you're processing, etc. We've done that at a lot of our locations. Sometimes we store stuff outside, sometimes we don't, and we don't have to meet this permit. Sometimes we store stuff and it's not really in a paved area where you're gonna have stormwater runoff to a drain, right? So a lot of different factors. A lot of states have different requirements when it comes to this. Um, my previous employer, we used to have a couple alcohols. We would pull samples out quarterly and then send off to a lab to be further sampled for oil and grease, soluble solids, right, and anything else that may play a factor in here. So, we do have an SW3P plan and specifically Sandusky. We do a lot of our outside storage. I know we have some storage in, the out cold storage that kind of helps prevent this. But what we're looking at is just really a stormwater inspection, which maintenance does that. And, they do pull a sample, they look at it, make sure it's clean, right? You don't notice anything unusual like an oil sheen or, metal or anything like that in there, right? Because, we can't have that happening. So that's the biggest key when it comes to that. All right. Yeah. So we identified pollution sources, implemented control measures, regular monitoring and reporting, including secondary containment strategies, right? So we don't really. One other thing too is oil drums being stored outside. Are they in a secondary containment for water or anything like that? Or if they would leak, we don't want it to leak down into groundwater or to a drain, right? So anything that we store from a used oil perspective should be on a secondary containment within the facility grounds, right? So I know we've had a little issue in that in the past with having a large amount of discharged drums when it comes to used oil, whether it's, protherm, paratherm, vegetable oil, getting rid of empty drums as well, right? So oil drums, getting rid of those. It's not a hazardous waste drum where you need to triple rinse it, but it's just an oil drum that we typically get swapped out whenever Crystal King comes and does some discharging for us or hauling off some waste. So TRIR, toxic relief into uh, um yeah, inventory. So this is always a fun one to do. It's an annual report that we have to do with all of our manufacturers. We don't always have to report everything that we have from a toxic release standpoint, which the biggest thing when it comes to stainless steel, which we work with, is chromium and nickel. If it's over a certain amount of poundage, then you have to report it. If not, then you don't. So most of us is pretty much reporting on chromium. Nickel maybe doesn't meet that threshold always, but always do the report, always do the calculation to make sure that we are compliant. That's essentially taking how much, inventory that you've purchased and processed, and then what you've scrapped, and you run that calculation on, how much was cut on the laser, how much was welded, how much was fabbed, right? And you do a calculation based off of what has been released into the environment from those um, different sources, right? So we're talking about releases during, like I said, cutting. Lasers, what do we do with the lasers? Is it filtered lasers, right? Are we doing anything else with it after the laser? Where we do fab it, we do bend it, and we do weld it. So a lot of this is kind of, I wouldn't say it's a swag number, unless scientific wild ass guess, but it is a good rough calculation, and the amount that we actually process is pretty minimal compared to some other facilities that are more of a heavier industry when it comes to that. So, again, this EPA regulation falls under 40 CFR Part 33, 372, excuse me. So, people don't know what CFR stands for. It's Code of Federal Regulation, right? It's law. So, um, interesting little note take. Next thing is tier two. Tier two is probably one that's easiest, but it's also one of the most important because it's a chemical inventory reporting that you report specifically to your national, state, and local agencies. And your local agency is typically your fire department, right? You want them to come on site, plus you want to send them this report stating, hey, you have X amount of quantities of, highly dangerous substances, whether it's ammonia, like hexane, acetone, even, I always report liquid nitrogens over a large quantity. You don't necessarily have to because it doesn't fall in that category, but I always put it on the log. There's nothing that really we don't pay any extra to submit the report to put liquid nitrogen on there, but it's always nice to have. So, we got ammonia in certain locations like in Russellville and Sandusky, and Sandusky, you have over 10,000 pounds of ammonia, so that's pretty important that they know about that. So if there would be an ammonia release or an emergency, they know what they're getting into when they get here. So with that, it's definitely a falls under the EPA CRA, which is involves chemical inventory reporting. And again, like I said, it provides local emergency planning committees and responders with information of hazardous chemicals at your facility. That's the important piece of this role, right? So, if there was an accident or release, they kind of know what they're dealing with. Again, I'm trying to make this a little bit a little tongue in cheek and easier to digest. There's a little bit more detailed in here. I don't think you guys want to know about the quantities of the thresholds or anything like that, but we can get into that if you have any questions on a later topic or a later note. So, in conclusions, the five things that we kind of look for are, your Title V or your non-TV permit, which we fall under your spill prevention controls and countermeasures, right? So when you think about that, you think about waste oil, used oil, whether it's stored on the facility grounds, inside the facility, outside the facility, and then your stormwater prevention and pollution plan, which involves, stormwater, right? So anything to do with stormwater. So the SPCC and SW3P kind of go hand in hand in a lot of different scenarios. And then your toxic relief inventory is kind of what you're processing and what's being released to the environment during your actual process, especially when it comes to stainless steel. That's the reason why we have to do that. And then your tier two is just your list of toxic chemicals in your work environment that's reported to local agencies in case there is an emergency and they have to respond. Compliance improves safety and reduces liability, right? And of course, there's always resources on the EPA website that's more knowledgeable. So, I don't really consider myself an environmental expert. There's a lot I don't know. The key is at least you know what you don't know, and you can do some research. I don't mess with this every day like I do most of the safety stuff. So a lot of times I have to kind of refresh my memory a little bit. I kind of know the idea, but the actual details kind of gets a little fuzzy occasionally at times. So, um, let's see, I got another slide here. I think I know I don't. So, pull this back up. We'll just stop sharing the screen here real quick, and then wrap this up. But we've covered a lot when it comes to air permits, chemical permits, chemical inventories, right? It's always important, each area. Um, it's not just a legal obligation, right? It's the obligation to also be, you know, processing and manufacturing in a sustainable way. So, for more information, check out your resources shown on, the notes in this presentation. Of course, you can always reach out to me or anybody else that may have some knowledge on this. I would, start there, for sure. Um, but thanks for watching. I think the next couple ones will be more interesting. I think we got a good topic coming up of, drug and alcohol. I guess substance abuse in the workplace would be one. Um, The other one that I'm looking at here would be, let me get back to it. How reporting a near miss can improve and affect your workplace. So we understand that reporting near misses are important, but how does it exactly affect your workplace if it's done appropriately? So, with that being said, I'll let you guys go, and if you got any other questions, just let me know. Thanks.